Hello, guys. Welcome to another episode of AWS Services Series. This video is going to be about one of the most important AWS services, which is AWS Identity and Access Management, also abbreviated as IAM. I'm going to start with what is IAM, and then we will look at what is a root user in AWS before looking at different type of identities in IAM. Next, we would be looking at the policies and its type. How does a policy structure look like? And we will finish off this session by doing a step-by-step walkthrough in AWS portal of everything we discussed. IAM basically controls access to AWS services and resources. It controls who can access or log in into AWS portal, which is basically authentication, and also controls what level of access a user gets to a particular resource, which in other words is authorization. So in short, IAM is responsible for both authentication and authorization in AWS. So for instance, if you want to give someone access to AWS and you only want to give them the ability to create maybe EC2 instances, then IAM is the service you'll utilize to create their user and also configure what they can do. Good thing about IAM is if you are a big organization and don't want to create all your user accounts again, then it supports federation with multiple SAML providers, including Azure Active Directory and Okta. So whenever you are making a move to AWS, you don't really need to create all your resources, users again. You just federate your existing identity provider if you are using one of the supported ones, and you just onboard all your users into AWS. When you first create your AWS account, you begin with creating a super user, which has complete control, or I would say access to all AWS services and resources in that account. If you are a Linux person, then you would already know how powerful a root user is. And the same applies here in AWS as well. Usually, root user is just used for performing initial setup, and then you use IAM identities, which we'll just discuss shortly to perform your day-to-day activities. However, you need to keep in mind there are some activities which you can only perform using root user credentials, such as changing your account settings or closing your AWS account or even registering as a seller in reserved instance marketplace. I strongly suggest you to read the tasks on your screen in more detail as there are questions related to root user in AWS Cloud Practitioner exam. Let's now look at different type of identities that exist in AWS IAM. The first one is users, which is basically an account for an individual to access AWS resources. It is different from root user. As I mentioned previously, root user is the super user, but IAM user is a different user which can have or cannot have equal permissions as a root user. Let's say you have a group of user whom you want to give identical permission. That's where the second type of identity comes into picture, which is called as groups. You will still need to create individual users. However, later on, you can group them and assign permissions to the group rather than assigning permissions to an individual, which is not the optimal way of doing this. Third type is called as roles, which enables a user or an AWS service to assume permissions to perform a task. For instance, you want to set up a EC2 instance, which needs to upload some data to a S3 bucket. So how do you grant EC2 instance permissions to upload objects to S3 bucket? You create a role which has required permission and you allow that EC2 instance to assume that role. Now, the assume role utilizes a service called as security token service or an STS service in background to get a temporary set of credentials that are used to access the AWS resources. Let's now look at how you assign permissions, which is where policies come into picture. Policy is just a JSON document which defines the permission for IAM identities, which can be a group, user, or a role. It defines both the service an identity can access and what are the actions it can perform on the service. There are policies that are managed by AWS, such as read-only access to a S3 bucket or even full access to EC2. But if AWS managed policies don't fulfill your requirement, then you can create more granular policies yourself, which are called as custom policies. Now, if you are creating a custom policy, you will be responsible for the management of that policy. But if you are utilizing a AWS managed policy, then obviously AWS is responsible for its management. Whenever there is any change in the objects, they update the policies accordingly. There are multiple type of policies in AWS. The most common ones are identity-based policies and resource-based policies. Identity-based policies are the ones that are attached to IAM identities, whereas the resource-based policies are the ones which are attached to resources. An example of resource-based policy can be a policy that is attached to a S3 bucket. We will look into this in more detail when we'll go through the demonstration in few minutes. But before going to demonstration, let's look at the structure of a policy. We need to understand this in more detail, as you can see some questions in the exam around different type of elements of a policy document. Okay, so each policy is made up of statements, and a policy can have multiple statements. The first element of the policy is version, which specifies the version of policy language you want to use. The next one is statement, which acts as a container for other elements of the policy. Now you can see on your screen this logical container starts with a square brace and ends with the square brace. The first element that is inside the statement container is SID, or also called as statement ID. It is an optional parameter. This is mostly used to differentiate between different statements. Then comes the main element effect, where you can specify either you are going to allow or deny whatever you mention in the action element. In our case, we are allowing list and get actions on a S3 bucket. Resource element, which is not always required, defines the resources on which the policy is applied. In our case, we are restricting the policy to allow specified actions on the S3 bucket named confidential data. This follows AWS IAM principle of least privilege, as we are restricting the access to just one bucket or the minimal required access. At the end, we have condition element, which is again an optional element. In our case, if user is not authenticated using MFA, then condition evaluates to false and user will not get access to confidential data bucket. And if this condition evaluates to true, that is they are authenticated using MFA, they'll get to see the objects in the bucket. But you don't really need to use this condition as it is an optional element. So if you don't really are not really bothered about MFA in your case, you don't need to use this condition. There is another element called as principal, which is only required in some cases, again, like creating a resource-based policy. Now, principal element contains the information about the user or a role. So as I said, you can expect to get some questions around the different type of elements of a policy structure. So go through the policy structure, and if you have any doubts, then post them in the comment section and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. let's now look at how things look like in AWS console. Okay, so we are now in Azure, AWS portal. Sorry about Azure, as I am working in both Azure and AWS, so sometime I goof up with the words. But getting back to the topic, we are in AWS at the moment. So yeah, we are in the AWS portal. Uh, let's so first, once you are logged in into the AWS portal, you can search for IAM. I already have the service as tagged in my favorite, so it shows at the top bar. But if you don't have it, you can type IAM in the services, and you'll be able to get to the IAM service console. So on the right, on the left-hand side in the ribbon, you can see you have the access management console where you have multiple options like user groups, user roles. These are all the identities which we talked about in some time. And then you get policies, identity providers, and then the account settings. Identity provider is something which you'll be using if you are trying to set a federation. But let's start with the users first. So when I click on users, you can see there is a user called as Jaspal_Singh already created in my case. However, I am logged in using a different user, which is a root user. And you cannot see the root user in the users section. So we will be using this user Jaspal Singh briefly in this demonstration to look at how the policies are applied and things are blocked when MFA is not set up. This user has already an MFA set up, and I have configured a virtual MFA. So let's try to create a user first. So what you do for creating a user, you click on add users and you are taken to the console where you need to specify the user details. So let's call our user as YouTube underscore demo. You can see at the bottom of the space where you need to enter the username, it says the user can have up to 64 characters and the valid characters are listed. So you need to take this into consideration when you are naming your user. Now, as an optional thing, we are going to provide this user access to the AWS management console. Uh, and when you are providing user access to AWS Management Console, you can either do it using Identity Center, or you can just create a IAM user, which we are going to do in this case. Why I don't want to use Identity Center is because I'm just doing a small demonstration and I'm going to create just one user. Identity Center is more recommended when you are creating a lot of users and you want to do federation and those sort of things, which we are not going to do at this point. So I'll just click, I want to create an IAM user. And then you do have option to either create an auto-generated password or you could use a custom password. So I'm going to give it a custom password at this point. Uh, yeah, and then you do have option to show your password if you want to just make sure what you have typed is right. And then there is an optional thing which you can check, which will basically make sure that the user changes the password when they are logging in for the first time. I'm going to just uncheck it just to avoid one extra step. Um, and here you can see when you are selecting this option, then there is automatically a policy called IAM user change password, which is tagged against their account. So basically, again, there is an inbuilt policy that is enforcing a password change when the user logs in for the first time. Now let's click next. Here you have options to set the permission when you are creating the user. So the options that you get is either you can add the user to a group. Basically, the group will have the policies tagged to it, which we will do shortly. But at the moment, we are just going to attach the policies directly. We are using the option attach policies directly. Now, the third option that you have is copy permission. Basically, copy permission is if you want to copy the permissions from an existing user, then you can use this option, and then you'll have to specify user. You see, if I choose copy permission, it gives me a user console where I have to select a user that I want to map the permissions with. Let's go back to attach policies directly. Now, what I want to do here is I am not going to attach any policies at this point because I want to show you how it looks like when you log in into the console without any policy or permission applied to you. So we'll just click next, and then it is just basically a review screen, which where you can just review your details. Uh, and yeah, just click create user. So the user has been created successfully. What we will do now is we will log in into the console using the this newly created user and see how things look like. So now you just need to make sure when you're using an IAM user to log in, you need to select the option IAM user. If you are using a root user, you need to select the option root user. When you use a root user, you need to specify their email ID. But when you use an IAM user, you need to specify the account ID or account alias, which gets generated when you create the user. So in our case, this is what was the account ID. Just click next, and it will take you to the screen where you need to input the user, basically IAM user name, and then you need to input their password. In our case, the username was YouTube_demo, which I have here. I'll put the password that I used while creating the user. Now you can see there are a bunch of options that you might see when you are logging in with the user for the first time. So at the top right, you can see I'm using use IAM user YouTube demo, and this is the account ID. Now, when I created this user, I didn't give it any permission. So let's say if I go to maybe IAM console, then I should see a bunch of errors because this user doesn't have access to IAM console. So you can see it's getting a lot of errors saying access denied, access denied. Now this behavior is varies from different service to service. Now let's say if I go to S3 console, I won't really see any errors, but I won't be able to see any existing buckets as well. Yeah, so this access denied thing behaves a bit different when you go to different service consoles. Let's try to go to the EC2 and see how it behaves there. I'll quickly go back to my previous user, which is the administrative user, and show that there are S3 buckets that exist, but they are not showing up to this user. But then it doesn't get any error as well. And now when I go to the EC2 console, you can see the error that I get is API error. So the behavior is different when you go to different consoles. Now, if you go to the details, then you can see that, yeah, the unauthorized operation. So the behavior varies when you go to different consoles. So you just need to be mindful that you can see different errors when you're going to browse different services. Let's now go back to the previous tab and see that we have existing S3 buckets which are not showing up for this user. If I click on S3, yeah, it's giving me this. No worries. Let's just click to. So since I did not download the instructions when the user was created, it is just prompting me that you have not downloaded the CSV file and you won't be able to retrieve the password again in future. In case you need, you'll have to reset it, which I don't really need because I know what I used for setting it up. Let's now go to the S3 console and verify that there are actually S3 buckets which were not visible to this user. So you can see already have a bucket named YouTube demo with the suffix of a date, which has two folders already created, which were not visible to the newly created user. So yeah, the behavior is the message that I wanted to convey was the behavior is different when you are browsing different AWS services. Let's now create a group with some permissions and try to add this user to that group and see the change. So what you do when you create a group, you just go to access management and hit create group on the top right side. Then you click then you need to enter the group name. So let's probably create a group called IAM full access and add our YouTube demo user to this group. And now this is the main part where you attach the permissions. And so you have a lot of permissions. As you can see, 829 permissions are there. So you need to search for what permission you are looking for to assign to this user. Let's try to search IAM. And you can see now there is a policy called IAM full access that is showing up on my screen. Let's expand it. Uh, and this is the JSON view of the policy, which we talked briefly in our session, where you can see the version is the 2012-10-17, which is the latest, and the effect is set to allow. And then in the action, you can see there is an action called IAM, and then you have a star basically to denote that all the actions are allowed. Then you do have bunch of organization related actions as well, which is not a scope of this discussion because we are not going to create an organization. uh, but then when you go to resources element, you again have a star which denotes that all actions on all resources are allowed when you have this permission. So we'll just select this permission, and we have already selected the YouTube demo user which we are going to add to this group. Let's click create group. So once you have created the group, you'll get a message, IAM full access user group created. That's the name of your group. Let's just go to the group and verify the user is there. You can see the user YouTube demo is there. And in the permissions, you can see the permission you selected when you were creating this group. Now let's go back to that user in the console and see whether this user can now access the IAM console or not to make sure that the permission has taken effect. Yep. So let's just click again on IAM again on the IAM and see if it makes any difference. Yeah. So now you are able to see things in IAM, which pretty much confirms that the permission that was applied to the group has got inherited to the users that were added to the group, and you can access the console. Now, since we gave the user the full access to IAM, so it has ability to create groups or users and even delete them. You can see the options are available there. Now, if we would have given it a permission, maybe a read permission, it wouldn't have been able to create things or even delete things. Now let's go to EC2 and just make sure it doesn't have got permissions to EC2. And you can see it again got the API error, which pretty much confirms that it doesn't have access to anything. Let's go to S3 and confirm the same thing. So yes, you can see the buckets are showing as empty here. So the next thing I would want to do is let's create another group called as S3 full access and try to give this user the permission to S3 bucket, because the next thing that I want to show you is based on that. So since this user already has full access to IAM, so I don't really need to go back to the previous one. Let's just create the group from here and add this user on its own. So let's click create group. Let's name the group as S3 full access. And we are going to add this user. Let's try to search S3 here. And you can see there is a policy for Amazon S3 full access. And if you look at the JSON, it says the effect is allow, and it's the action is set to S3 and then star, obviously all S3 buckets. This really doesn't follow the AWS principle of least privilege. So we should avoid doing this, or at least be very mindful when we are granting this kind of blanket permission to the resources. In production environment, we will never do that, but since we are just doing a demo and we want to see how the policies are created and groups are created, so I'm just doing that for this. Then in the resources, you can see it's again a blanket permission. You have full control over all resources. So let's click create group. Yeah, so the group is created, and if you click on the group, the user has got added to this group, and the permissions are there. Let's now go to the S3 console and see whether it can view the buckets or not. So as you can see, the bucket is now visible and it can see both the folders as well. If I go inside the folder, it can see the objects as well. Yep. So the next part that I wanted to show you comes into picture now, which is when I was going through the presentation, I did mention that you can apply policies to a S3 bucket, which are like the resource-based policies. So I already have created a policy here, and that's what we are going to explore now. So if we go to permissions, you can see there is a bucket policy already applied. Now, what this bucket policy is, this bucket policy is basically, it is applied. Now, this is, so you can see when I was telling that in resource-based policy, you will have an element called principal. So this principal element again has a star, which is like it gets applied to all, and the action is S3, all actions on S3. And this policy is applied to just one resource in our case. So it is restricted to not the whole bucket, but it is restricted to a folder called folder one inside that bucket. Okay. Uh, and the effect is deny. Now here I have the condition, which is an optional parameter, but I'm utilizing it. So what I'm trying to do here is whenever any object, even though they might have full access to S3, but if they are not authenticated using multi-factor authentication, then this resource, they won't be able to access this resource. So even though the permissions given to them allow them to access everything in S3 in all the buckets, but I do have a explicit permission that is specified on that bucket, which will block their access, which is also called as an implicit deny, basically. So what I'm going to do here is, if you are not authenticated using multi-factor authentication, you will not be able to access the content of the folder one in this bucket, which is what we are going to do. So this new user with which we are logged in at the moment does not have MFA set up. So when it tries to access anything inside folder one, it should get access denied. Let's first try to access something which is under the different folder, which is not folder one. So what I'll do is I'll click on this PNG, and if I try to open this, you can see I am able to access this image, which is my channel's logo, and yeah, you don't get any error messages. Now let's go back to the other folder and try to access the image that is there. This is basically an image which I was using in our presentation for a demonstration. So if I click open, you can see you get an error message that the access is denied, which confirms because this user is not authenticated using MFA, you cannot access this. Now let's try to log in using the other user, which is my personal user and which has MFA set up already, and see how it behaves for it. Before going to that, let me just show you that the user is added to administrator group. So It has all the permissions actually. I have not added it exclusively to IAM full access or S3 full access. The user is added to administrator. So if we look at the permissions of the administrator, it has access to everything. You see, effect is allow, action is star, and resource is a star. So it can do pretty much everything in your AWS account. So let's go back. Probably I'll open an incognito session in which I'm going to log in using this user. Or I'll log out here and try to log in using that user and see how it behaves. So I'm currently logged in using my user. As you can see on the top right, the username is Jaspal_Singh, and that's the account ID. Now let's go to the S3 console. Yeah, go to the bucket. Let's go to the folder without MFA first, just to make sure it can access this image as well. So as expected, it can access this image. Let's go back to the other folder and just make sure that it can access the other image as well. Yes, you can see the image is open, which pretty much confirms that it is able to access this image as well, because this user is authenticated using MFA. That's the critical part here. That's where the condition is getting evaluated, whether it's true or false, and the access to the buckets takes place. Before we proceed to the next step, I already had the policy created, but I just want to show you how you can create the policy. So let's go to the bucket policy and click edit. Now, when you click edit, you get to the policy editor uh, option. Now, if you are someone who doesn't like working with JSON or probably not comfortable with the syntax, what you can do is you can go to the policy generator. This is a GUI tool, basically to to generate a JSON format for you, and then you can copy the format and put it there. So the first step you get to do here is you need to select the policy type. Now I was creating a S3 bucket policy, so let's go ahead and select S3 bucket policy. Then in the statement, you need to select whether your statement is either an allow or a deny. So let's select deny for now. Now in the principle, you need to you just put a star here. And now the AWS service you can see is grayed out for me because I already have selected S3 bucket policy at the top. So that's why it is showing as Amazon S3. Now in the action, you have option to specify what action you want to choose. But in our case, we are just going to choose all actions, so star. Uh, in the ARN, now you need to now every resource that is created in Amazon AWS has its ARN. So you need to go to the bucket properties and get the ARN, which we are going to do now. So yeah, this is the ARN we are just going to copy. This is the ARN of the bucket. Just copy it here. Yeah, and now you get an option to add conditions. Again, this is optional. You don't really need to always add it. But we are going to add the one that was there for MFA. So yeah, that was a bool statement. So we'll select in the condition, we'll select bool, and then we will need to select key. Now in the key, you need to see there are tons of keys here basically. So you need to choose which one is relevant to you. For us, I think it was S3 and then let me just go. I think it was multi-factor auth present. Yeah, this is the one. Let me just cross check in the existing policy to make sure I'm selecting right things. Yeah, multi-factor auth present. Now I'll intentionally make a error here just to show you what happens when you have something wrong. It is a case sensitive error. So I have inputted false with a capital F. Now so what you need to do now is click on add statement. Statement got added. Now you need to select your optional thing as well. I think it has removed. So because the condition is saying is none. So let's just create the condition again and add it. Yep. Let's click add condition. Yep. Let's click generate policy. So here you can see it has generated. Oh, hold on. I think I need to select it. Trusting it's behaving a bit different, but let's do start over and see how it behaves here. So it seems it wants me to click add condition first and then click add statement. So anyways, we now have the policy generated along with the condition that we wanted to have there. We just now click generate policy. So here we have the policy. You just need to copy the policy and then go to your bucket and paste it there. So let's just replace it and paste. Now you can see at the bottom there is one warning which I wanted to have it there intentionally, and you can see that type mismatch boolean is showing up at line 12. So this is very case sensitive when it comes to boolean. Now if I make it small f, the warning will go away. So you can see there are no warnings at this point. So you need to be a bit cautious when you are creating policies. And the good thing about this is it validates the policies even before you hit save. So you know what errors are there and you get an opportunity to fix them. So yeah, folks, this is what I wanted to show you when it comes to creating a policy and applying it directly on a resource. Let's now look at how assume role works. So for assume role, what I have done is basically, as I mentioned previously, assume role is used. Uh, uh, One of the example is basically if you have an EC2 instance and it wants to access S3 bucket, and how do you provide access to EC2 instance to access S3 bucket, which we are going to do now shortly. And you create roles for that. Let's first see, I already have a EC2 instance created, whether it can access the S3 bucket or not. So if I go to my EC2 console, I'm still using this parsing user because it is an admin. So I am able to access everything. Uh, so I just click connect. Now it gives me the URL that I can use to SSH into the VM, which I'll do now. So I'm on a command prompt. I'll just copy the command that I use to access my EC2 instance on this now. So as you can see now, I am on SSH onto my EC2 instance. What I'll do here is I'll run a command AWS S3 ls just to list all the buckets to confirm whether it can access the buckets or not. Looks like there was some error. I think it didn't like my capital S. Let me just change it to small. Yep. So again, you can see case sensitive is a thing which you need to be aware of when working with AWS. It says unable to locate credentials. You can configure credentials by running AWS configure. Now, when you are running AWS configure, you are creating static credentials which will be saved somewhere, which we don't want to. So what we'll do is we'll go back to the AWS console, we'll create a role, and assign that role to this EC2 machine and come back and see whether this machine can access the S3 bucket after that or not. So back to our AWS console, let's go to IAM and create a role. For creating a role, you just need to, again, go into the roles section and click create role. Now, this is one of the important thing that you need to be across when you are creating a role. What is the trusted entity type that you select? So in our case, we are going to assign this role to a service. So we are going to select AWS service. But let's say this role is getting assumed by maybe a user which is authenticated by a SAML 2.0 federation, which is like from Azure Active Directory or from Okta. So you will be selecting this option, SAML 2.0 federation. But let's say you are going to your user is going to federate through a third party social website like Facebook or Twitter, then you are going to select web identity, and then AWS account is like when you are using organization, an account from a different organization is going to make changes in your account, so you are going to use this option. And then the last one is custom trust policy. So let's select AWS service, and then when you scroll down, you get the use cases, and it shows the most common use cases to use this is EC2 and Lambda. So we are going to select EC2 because EC2 is the service, like EC2 instance is going to assume this role. Okay, let's click next now. Now here is the thing that what are the permissions that the entity which is going to assume this role is going to get. So let's search for the permission as S3. And you can see Amazon S3 full access. Again, if we expand this, you can see the JSON view that it's going to have a blanket access on S3. Yep. You can set up permission boundaries as well, which is an optional. We are not going to do that, but permission boundaries is something which you would use if you want to control the maximum permissions that this role can have. Basically, let's say you are trying to set up something which is very wide unintentionally, but you have a permission boundary set already. So even though you are giving it a blanket permission, the permission boundary will not let it happen. Let's click next as we have already selected the permission we wanted to have. Now you need to give it a name. So let's probably give it EC2 role for S3. And in the description, you can see since the service was selected, it automatically gives it a description, allow EC2 instances to call AWS services on your behalf. And here in the trusted entities, you can see the effect is set to allow, and the action is STS assume role. Remember when I was talking initially, I was mentioning about this, that STS is the service which works in background to get you temporary credentials, get temporary credentials on your behalf, and then the AWS service uses them. And in the principle, you can see the service selected is ec2.amazonaws.com, which specifies that you have selected EC2 service to assume this role. If you scroll down in the permissions, you can see Amazon S3 full access. Yeah, you can optionally assign tags if you want to, but we are not going to do that. And just click create role. Yeah, so it will take few seconds for the role to be created, and then yeah, we should be able to assign it. So the role has got created. Let's now go to again, you can see here the trusted entities Amazon service EC2, and this is the role name. Let's now go to EC2 instances and assign this role to our instance. So yeah. You can assign the role by going to the instance, and in the actions, you go to security and then click modify IAM role. So you need to remember that you can only have one role assigned to the instance at a time. So if you want to give the EC2 instance or any service more permissions, then you need to make sure that you are selecting all the permissions that you are creating role. When you are creating role, you have options to modify the role. So this is not something that if you forgot to select the permission that you want to give to the role, you can't modify it. You obviously can modify it, but what I wanted to stress is you can just select one IAM role which is assigned to the service. So in our case, let's select the role EC2 role for S3, which we shortly created, and click update IAM role. So this should have given access to the EC2 instance to view the S3 buckets. For just sake, we will just go back and see the role is selected here. So what we are going to do is now we are going back to our command prompt, and we'll try to do ls again and see how it looks like now. So we are back to our command prompt. Let's try to run this command again and see how it comes back. So you can see it came back with an output now that this is the bucket name, which pretty much confirms that it was able to call the STS service in background and assume that role and access the S3 bucket. So folks, this is all I wanted to cover as part of the IAM demonstration. If you are interested in any topic that is outside of this, of what I covered in IAM, please feel free to comment them in the comment section, and I'll get back to you with a new video or explanation in the comment section itself. If you liked the content and this content has helped you in any way, please subscribe my channel and share this content with your colleagues as well. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.